Well, welcome everyone. I'm Kristen Muller, Director of Peters Valley School of Craft in Layton, New Jersey. And I want to acknowledge our partners at the Pike County Library, who typically we held these lectures in their library, but due to COVID, we began doing them virtually, and now we can reach people all over the country, which is really exciting. I want to thank our funders at the Greater Pike County Community Foundation, and specifically the Richard L. Snyder Fund for funding this lecture, because we are just so delighted to bring amazing artists and curators to present to you. Um, and tonight we welcome Elizabeth Essner. And geez, Elizabeth, we've been working on this exhibition for about a year and a half, wouldn't you say? I think it's
That's about
been a
right.
year.
Yeah.
Um, and Elizabeth Essner is an independent curator, writer, and researcher based in Brooklyn, New York. She's curated exhibitions in institutions including the Aldridge Contemporary Art Museum in Connecticut, Urban Glass in Brooklyn, New York, the Woodlands, a historic estate in West Philadelphia, and the Center for Craft in Asheville, North Carolina, where she was a 2017 curatorial fellow. A frequent magazine's contributor as well, Elizabeth serves as the curator and catalog author of the Peters Valley 50th Anniversary Exhibition, From the Ground Up, Peters Valley School of Craft, which is now open at the Hunterdon Art Museum in Clinton, New Jersey through January 10th. Um, Elizabeth is currently working with Jennifer Zwilling, who's the curator of artistic programs at the Clay Studio in Philadelphia. And the Clay Studio is building a new space. And in that space, they're going to have an inaugural show called Making Place Matter. And this is going to be an exhibition in South Kensington, working with artists Molly Hatch, Ibrahim Saeed, and Kakuli Velarde. And I just want to say that Elizabeth answered our call for a curator for our 50th exhibition. And we just won the lottery with you, because boy, have you worked hard, put together the most thoughtful and interesting exhibition. And we're so grateful and really looking forward to this evening. So before I hand it over to you, I just wanted to say that if you're not familiar with Zoom, on the bottom, there's a little chat function where you can make comments. But if you've got questions for Elizabeth, please type them in the Q&A section. We will answer them at the end of the lecture. So Elizabeth is going to talk to us. Please ask questions. We'll hold them there and we'll get to them at the end in about half an hour. So welcome, Elizabeth. Take it away.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see here. Just give me a moment. And can everyone see that okay? I'm going to hope so. Yeah, works okay.
Yep,
Great.
See it. We're good.
Perfect. All right. So, hi, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Essner. I am the curator of this exhibition that you're looking at here, From the Ground Up. And I hope that tonight, at least for a moment, I can provide a tiny bit of distraction as we all refresh our feeds for election results. So tonight we'll take a little dive into this exhibition, which is currently, as Kristen said, on view at the Hunterdon Art Museum in Clinton, New Jersey. And as Kristen also said, I hope there'll be questions from all of you. So as you think of them, just go ahead and pop them into that little Q&A in the chat, and I'll look forward to answering them at the end of my talk. So to quote the brilliant curator, Michelle Miller-Fisher, teamwork makes the dream work. And here you can see the Peters Valley team in action in 1977. They were putting up what was then the new Peters Valley sign, which you can see there, made by the eminent Emil Milan woodworker, who you can see leaning against this blue truck. He's wearing all blue on the right here, and an armature made by Tom Majorana, who I think is up top there. But in any case, similar to this kind of teamwork, this project from the ground up has really been an absolute group effort. It includes an exhibition, and within that, an artist residency, a catalog, a host of educational programs, and it has really brought together two important New Jersey arts institutions, Peters Valley, of course, and the Hunterdon Art Museum. Both are small but mighty. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the work of so many people that have made this possible. First, of course, our funders, New Jersey Council for the Humanities, Windgate Foundation, Marie and John Zimmermann Fund, and the catalog, which was also supported by Windgate and John Sheridan and Andrea DuFlon. Our lenders so generously have shared the wonders of their collection with us to illuminate this important history. And the Peters Valley staff has given their time and their resources to this project. Kristen's fearless leadership, Jennifer Apgar's incredible institutional memory, Lakota's beautiful photographs, the countless hours that Brienne and Rachel and Bruce Dennert, whose work also graces the show, have contributed. And I want to have a very special thanks to Grace Reff, who has been an essential partner in this project. Similarly, at the Hunterdon Art Museum, Marjorie Nathanson, their director, along with Ellen Marr, who coordinated the exhibition, Brian Kearney, who does incredible PR and social media, their education team, Caitlin, Joan, Jason, Mary Ellen at the front desk, and Naris at the front desk have all come together to make this a reality. So I just want to acknowledge how many people make this work. So as I mentioned, there's a catalog, and here's a little preview, which it includes not only a beautiful illustrated essay, and I'm just going to hold it up here too, so you can see it in action. But for the historians and the artists among us, it has some really essential information of resident craftspeople and visiting artists that have been a part of Peters Valley over its 50-year history. This one is ceramics. And this was designed along with all of the exhibition graphics by the incredible design team, Doug and Angela at the graphics office. So when I first began working on this project, I knew that Peters Valley was a craft school, and I knew that it had been founded 50 years ago in 1970. But what I also found was that the results of what was essentially a really experimental idea, right? A planned craft residency-based community and school set inside a national park, the Delaware Water Gap. What I found was a place that had had a significant impact on larger artistic and craft histories, on creative pedagogy, and on the trajectory of individual artistic careers. So, as we are acutely aware in this moment, history matters. And as I was researching this exhibition, despite this being a small institution, I knew I could never tell what is a much larger 50-year history. But my hope is that this exhibition and this catalog can lay the groundwork for the continuation of those stories to be told, which can connect the dots between individual histories of artists, the places that they have inhabited, larger artistic movements and moments in time. So for this exhibition, I began looking at all of the materials that are at Peters Valley. You can see I went through a lot of old slides, old newsletters, but most of all, I began my research by talking with artists and with craftspeople who had been residents, students, instructors, assistants, staff, sometimes all of the above. And in my conversations about their experiences, there was this word that kept bubbling up. And that word was formative, this moment when something takes shape. And this idea of formative moment really became my organizing principle, a chance to capture connections between artists and their materials, between students and instructors, and a way to capture one formative moment for each of Peters Valley's material disciplines, which I will discuss this evening. So just to put Peters Valley's formation in a little bit of context, it both fits into and is actually distinct from the loose network of non-degree granting craft schools and residency programs that have arisen throughout the 20th century in the US. They are largely decentralized and largely, although not always, situated outside of urban centers. And many of the earliest were founded in Southern Appalachia. Arrowmont School of Craft was founded in 1912, John C. Campbell Folk School in 1925, and of course, Penland School of Craft in 1929. After World War II, there was a new wave of craft schools that emerged, often as an extension of the growing field of studio craft. And those like Haystack Mountain School of Crafts in Maine became a place for summer research and experimentation. And for those of you interested in craft school histories, there is an incredible catalog that charts an exhibition called In the Vanguard, which was certainly an essential point of reference for me and just an excellent, excellent resource. So Peters Valley is among what is that sort of next generation of craft schools. Its formation in 1970 really intersected with two movements that had each taken hold in the national consciousness of the period. Of the 1960 countercultures movement, sort of back to the land spirit, and the field of studio craft, which by 1970 had really entered the cultural mainstream. Peters Valley was born into an environment of flourishing craft fairs, craft centers, and public interest in the field. Today, workshop-based education craft centers have developed into essential waypoints for artists and art educators. I often think of them as sort of in-between spaces. They are a retreat from the solitary artist studio, the bustle of production, or the long-term commitment of a formal degree. Instructors, fellows, assistants, and students find support that leads to artistic exchange, community, skill building, and often career advancement. Now, places like Peters Valley are unbeholden to academia, and so they can pivot quickly to reflect emerging trends in the field. They can offer access to major figures, like here you see ceramic artist Toshiko Takiezu and famed woodworker Jerry Osgood, both former Peters Valley instructors. Which sort of leads us to the history of Peters Valley itself. The land that is now Peters Valley sits at the northwestern edge of New Jersey. It is the ancestral homeland of today's Delaware tribe of Indians, Delaware Nation, and the Stockbridge-Munsee community. And beginning in the 17th century, Dutch and British settler colonists forced their removal and then worked what is now Peters Valley as farmland for generations. So everything began to change in 1955. Two successive hurricanes submerged the area, creating costly cleanup. The government's response was the Tox Island Dam project, an ill-fated Army Corps of Engineers proposition to flood the area and create what they imagined was a 40-mile-long lake-like reservoir and dam. Congress approved the project in 1962, and by 1967, the Army Corps took the historic village structures of a town called Bevins, what is now Peters Valley, by eminent domain. So just to give you a sense, there was an entire sort of village. There were churches, farmhouses, barns, chicken coops, even a local post office that were seized, and there was a displacement of 8,000 people in the process. And over time, public resistance to this project grew and opposition gave way to change as Congress really abandoned the plan. The land was subsequently turned over to the National Park Service to become what is today the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area, which is 70,000 acres. So the land had been transferred, but the historic buildings remained without a purpose. So according to a tiny sliver of a mention in a 1972 New York Times article, the Peters Valley, the idea for Peters Valley came from a Norwegian-American potter named Inger Garrison, who also happened to be the wife of Lon Garrison, then the National Park Service Northeast Regional Director. Inger was a lifelong advocate for Indigenous communities and suggested that the village become an Indigenous craft center. Although the focus broadened to include contemporary craft of the time, Peters Valley's formation demonstrated the on-the-ground impact of the craft movement in the late 1960s. Not only national leaders, of course, like the American Craft Council, but also there was a groundswell of local craft leagues, guilds, informal groups that had emerged across the country, including those in New Jersey. And in New Jersey, this included the League of the Kittatinny Craftsmen, which was co-founded by a craft person and crackerjack arts administrator named Sally D. Francisco, who you can see here in this center picture on the right. She was tapped to lead the charge, working with the National Park Service, Peter Degalecki, whom you see here on the left in that center image. So to test the feasibility of Peters Valley, a craft fair was held in August of 1970. There were just about 30 exhibitors, and they anticipated a few hundred visitors. More than 4,000 arrived. Plans for the craft community vaulted ahead. So for Francisco and her team, the task of building an organization from the ground up, while balancing the needs of a young, left-leaning staff and the strict requirements of a federal agency were significant. And my research certainly reflects the cultural and financial growing pains of an underfunded upstart arts organization. Some were specific to Peters Valley, but others dealt with divergent tendencies held within the craft movement at the time. The institution's formation nurtured historic traditions, blacksmithing, weaving, while the community also embraced countercultural movements rooted in avant-garde art and experimental living. As Peters Valley's first resident, Andrew Wilner, explained to me while I was researching this, he said the original organizers may have imagined a sort of colonial Williamsburg, but instead they got hairy hippies. So for craftspeople at Peters Valley, work and life and making were really intertwined. Residents would live on site for anywhere from a year or two to a decade. They were not paid. Their primary source of income was meant to be their work, which was sold at the Peters Valley shop, at crafts fairs, and elsewhere. But they were given affordable, if rustic, housing, a studio, and responsibilities to demonstrate their work, give public tours, arrange visiting instructors, teach their own classes. As Sally Francisco would later recall in an oral history, she said, primarily our aim was to give young students who were just graduating from art schools a place to get settled, perfect their own talents, and learn to make money. It was a chance, she said, for residents to develop themselves before they went out into the big, wide world. So as Peters Valley's resident woodworker, Andrew Wilner, whom you see here on the right and whose work you see on the left, he arrived in the spring of 1971. He was fresh out of Virginia Commonwealth University, where he had studied with furniture maker Alan Lazarus, who in turn was a disciple of the great American furniture maker Wendell Castle. And you can see these influences in the sculptural, nearly oozing approach to stack lamination of Wilner's volcano table. However, like many of the other early residents, before Wilner could create his own work at Peters Valley, he was tasked with building the studios themselves, which were all retrofitted from historic structures. He tells the story of this sort of energetic spirit of improvisation that was all among the young staff. As Wilner recalled, a week before students were to arrive in the first summer of 1971, the small team realized that everyone had to be housed and fed, and they sprang into action. He said, we found a prep table and an old refrigerator and made a dining room. The dormitory was fashioned from an old farmhouse. We planted a garden, and by August, that garden was feeding people who were enrolled in classes and staying at the Valley. So Wilner was among those that were influenced by this man, Emil Milan, who came to Peters Valley in 1971, already very well recognized in his field. His work had been included in the genre-defining 1953 Designer Craftsman USA exhibition. He had a successful career in production, features in the New York Times, in Craft Horizons. If you're interested in learning more about this important American woodworker, there is an excellent book put out by the Center for Art and Wood called Emil Milan, Mid-Century Master. And Milan really remained at Peters Valley as a formal instructor and also a sort of informal resident until 1984. And over his 13 years at Peters Valley, he, who was an excellent carver, took many of the younger woodworkers under his wing. He taught carving to students, including his then assistant in 1973, John Sheridan, whose work you can see here in the foreground on the right slide. John Sheridan recalls Peters Valley as his alma mater, and Sheridan spent a week in Milan's class in 1973 carving this gentle sweep of his cherry spoon. And you can see those same curves and arcs reflected in Milan's own work in this segmented bowl from 1967 that is just beyond. So there are a lot of really wonderful stories embedded into the objects in this exhibition, and this, I have to say, is one of my favorites. So the wife of John Sheridan, whose spoon we just saw, was Carolyn Grew Sheridan, who was a fellow wood assistant in 1974, and she found a mentor in Joyce Anderson, the famed New Jersey woodworker who, with her husband Edgar, would teach at Peters Valley. So Anderson was known for her exceptional wood turning skill, and this she passed on to Grew Sheridan in a 1974 class when Grew Sheridan was turning these candlesticks. The bowl is by Anderson. And like many who formed bonds at Peters Valley, the couples actually remained friends long after the Sheridans headed west to found Grew Sheridan Studios in San Francisco. And John would later recall Carolyn's role as a teacher and a writer and a mentor, and how she had made their studio a haven for women woodworkers in a largely male-dominated field. Another really wonderful story. This is a fellow resident in wood, Carl C. Muller, whose stool you see here on the left. He had a young family living at Peters Valley. He was always in search of production efficiencies to make ends meet as a woodworker. So he didn't like to waste it all. And this stool was his most popular offering, and of course pays homage to the founding father of American studio craft, Wharton Esherick. So as you can see in this seat, it's a triangular seat, and there were certainly offcuts in order to make it. And from these, he would create these very charming fish rattles that you can see here on the right, which he would sell, of course, at craft fairs and the Peters Valley store. So the 1970s was certainly a fertile decade, and the courses and fiber at Peters Valley reflected the medium's richness. In addition to traditional weavers, visiting instructors included noted artists like Yvonne Boberwitz and Louise Todd Cope, who taught textile awareness in 1976, just as she was making her thread poem series, of which this work on the left is one. And among fiber's other innovators was Janet Lipkin, who arrived at Peters Valley in 1972 as one of the earliest residents in fiber. Lipkin was a leader in shaping a small but vibrant new movement now known today as art to wear. Lipkin had begun working in freeform crochet as a junior at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, and she was among the young movement's originators. So not long after graduation, she came to Peters Valley and she created this incredible bird coat from 1972, which is among the animals and wearable sculptures that she really created as a means to explore spiritual transformation. As an artist, she really mastered her material down to its roots, becoming an expert in spinning, teaching natural dyeing, which was often derived from sources found at Peters Valley. She invited her personal circle into the school's fold, including these fellow Pratt graduates, and she has said that it was formative for all of us in her short but vital period of incubation. So Lipkin made this piece that is in the show, Jacob's Coat of Many Colors, just after her departure west to California. It is based on the Bible story, and this doll face of woven wool is on the hood's reverse. So although Peters Valley offered a handful of photography classes from the start, The first official photography resident was Wendy Holmes, seated in this image just on the right, part of a photography class taught by photographer John McWilliams, whom you see seated kind of blurry on the far left. Holmes came to Peters Valley in 1975, just as the war in Vietnam was ending and America was taking stock of its own history in preparation for the 1976 bicentennial. And in parallel with craft practices, photography at Peters Valley looked back to history as a way to chart the future. So Holmes had been invited to teach to Peters Valley by Sandy Noyes, a book editor turned photographer whom she knew from their shared study with the luminary photographer Minor White. Holmes would actually eventually marry Noyes and spent 5 years as resident, building a darkroom studio in the basement of the school's Greek Revival building, programming workshops like these that we're looking at here, and capturing the aura of Peters Valley in palladium and platinum prints, a historical process revived from the 19th century. So Holmes's energy also led her to apply for and receive a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts to bring 7 photographers to the Delaware Valley from 1976 to 77. The project focused on the place itself, and palladium and platinum printing united much of the work, from this smoky montage by John McWilliams to the richness of this Gordon Hardwin print. The resulting 40 images became 7 photographers, the Delaware Valley. It was a traveling exhibition reviewed by the New York Times, and in 1979, its final destination was the New Jersey State Museum, where the works entered the permanent collection. And we've reprised this exhibition thanks to the New Jersey State Museum. We have a sort of mini retrospective of it, and it's really fascinating to see how insightfully they capture really this distinct moment in time, but also really highlight the enduring power of the landscape at Peters Valley. Ceramics had always been an anchor at Peters Valley since its inception, and the course of clay education would change drastically in April of 1978, when an accidental fire burned down the original ceramics studio. The studio was rebuilt, but the accident prompted Peters Valley to seek a new direction that matched the future of the field. The Japan Foundation provided a way, granting half of the funds needed to build the first anagama kiln for public use in the US. Of course, a private anagama kiln was built by ceramic artist Peter Callis in 1976 that had preceded it. The anagama, or a Japanese wood-fired kiln, is a long single-chamber kiln that tunnels into the hillside, and you can see it here on the top left image. By design, the kiln's natural wood ash glazes the clay, and controlling it is as much an art as it is a science. Its effects vary greatly based on heat, weather, placement of the work. The kiln's technology is ancient. It made its way from China to Korea, and in the 5th century to Japan, where it was in primary use until just about the 16th century. And in the late 1960s, new investigations into firing techniques, popularized by publications like Daniel Rhodes' Kilns, Design, Construction, and Operations, spurred a search for artistic rather than efficient firing methods. So Japanese master kiln builder Katsuyuki Sakazumi was invited to Peters Valley, having just built an anagama kiln in Japan for a designated living national treasure in his country. And for a year, he lived there with his family on site as he taught and built the 46-foot-long tunnel that burrows into the hillside behind the ceramic studio. And if you're looking for a deep dive into the history of the anagama at Peters Valley, there's a really wonderful exhibition catalog called Riding the Wave, 30 Years of Firing from 2013 that I think is still available. So the anagama's annual firing is an event of considerable labor and ritual. It is overseen each year by a kiln master, and the anagama can hold more than 1,000 pieces, which takes just about 3 days to load. And during firing, it is stoked around the clock for 5 to 6 days using 25,000 pounds of wood. And once cooled, the works are unloaded onto the surrounding hillside to illustrate the anagama's varying effects on each piece. And I particularly love these commemorative tiles from the first anagama firing in 1981. They really illustrate the kiln's dazzling surface effects. They also honor the kiln's many supporters at its inception, and these, of course, include the groundbreaking ceramic artist Peter Volkes, who you see here in the picture on the right. We're showing a workshop, and it's interesting because this picture just surfaced recently after the exhibition opened, so it's really a pleasure to be able to see. So figures like Kirk Mangus, whose work you see here in the foreground, made work in the Anagama while teaching as a visiting instructor during Jim Jansma's tenure. You can also see Bruce Dennert's work here, a 20-year ceramics department head at Peters Valley, still and wonderfully so. Jansma's own monumental pot, you can see here on the left, demonstrates the dynamism possible from the Anagama. And you can also see the work here by Kristen herself, a pod vessel from 2009, just as she joined Peters Valley as executive director. So in just one example of many trajectories of an artist's career, this is the work of Malcolm Oboteu Smith, who was a young student and a summer assistant at Peters Valley in the late 1980s. And here he is, you can see, with some of his Anagama-fired work. Now he is a professor at the University of Indiana in Bloomington. And in 2019, nearly 20 years later, he has returned as a visiting instructor. And you can see his evolution from these early Anagama pieces to this work on the top right called Whitewash, made in 2010, actually, during the Obama presidency, a way to grapple with Black stereotypes and the appropriation of Black cultural production, and of course shown in 2020 with the current rightful calls for racial justice. It stands in even starker relief. But his work has primarily been informed by these two works below, Search for Abstraction in the Vessel Form. So Peters Valley is one of a handful of schools that offer blacksmithing classes and residencies in this small, very highly specialized field. And we're looking here at the work of resident Glen S Gardner, who was at Peters Valley from 1973 to 1977. Gardner's work would evolve while he was there, from making small knives to creating works like this, Bicentennial Weather Vane, which was originally made in 1976 and which Glen very graciously made for this exhibition. He remade the entire thing for us. So From the Ground Up goes on to focus on blacksmithing in the late 1990s and early 2000s, beginning with the resident John Rais, who in 1998 became the 12th resident blacksmith, having been a summer assistant the previous year. The name for Bean Screen, this work that we're looking at on the left, is actually coincidental to the fire screen's owner, who is Race's friend and Peters Valley visiting ceramics instructor and board chair at one point, Bennett Bean, whose work you see here on the right. But instead, the bean is actually a blacksmith's reference to a bean-shaped plate on a colonial era Suffolk door latch design. And Race has transformed the simplicity of this original kind of blacksmithing reference point into a sweeping foliate-like garden. And this piece was actually published in American Craft, helping to launch Race's blacksmithing career. Demonstrating the field's pathways to growth, Race selected two of his summer assistants, Maegan Crowley and Vivian Beer, whose work we'll look at next. And this is Maegan Crowley, who followed Race to become the resident blacksmith in 2001. Her 3-year residency became a stepping stone to founding her own active studio in Colorado, where she pursued the field as a trade and as an artistic pursuit, including works like this made in 2004, Antler Plaque. So here is Vivian Beer, who has become a guiding star in furniture design. This was her as a 21-year-old at Peters Valley, and she has often warmly described this image here on the top left as her 21-year-old self and a pile of dudes. In this largely male-dominated field, neither Beer nor Crowley turned to blacksmithing to prove a point about gender. Instead, they were both really drawn to the medium's innate possibilities as a trade and an artistic pursuit. In the show, in addition to showing Lowrider Lounge, which you see here, we also show both a concept model and this 1/6 scale model, which really demonstrates how she clarifies the work before large-scale fabrication. And of course, her blacksmithing skill shines in this bent steel frame. It is actually lined in concrete, although I always think that it looks like shagreen. And she has imbued these incredibly industrial materials with a surprising amount of both comfort and grace. So over Peters Valley's 50 years, artist residents and visiting instructors have explored silversmithing and jewelry making using traditional and avant-garde approaches. These artists represent a range of involvement in the fine metals department, from student to emerging and established artists, and their work today captures the diversity of materials, methods, and conceptual thinking, which I think are really reflective of the exciting jewelry field at large. Lucy Jockel's trajectory really demonstrates the stepping stone that Peters Valley can offer as a part of an artist's career trajectory. She was an artist fellow in 2017, an instructor in 2019, and that same year, 2019, she was also an American Craft Council Emerging Voices artist. Shroud, I think, definitely demonstrates why. It is an absolutely magisterial object. This is bee wing lace, which has been placed over this delicate fawn skull, offering a beautiful and haunting reminder of what climate change leaves in its wake. Doug Bucci, whose work we see here on the right, has diabetes and rendered this 3D printed skull-filled filigree bowl as an embodiment of the dangerous impact of sugar on his condition. He is the head of metals at Tyler School of Art and a leader in the field. And he was also a professor of Lauren Eckert, one of our artists in residence for this exhibition, who we'll talk about in a moment. Two other works from the jewelry section of contemporary work. On the right, we have Beryl Perrin-Feller, who began as a student and became an assistant at Peters Valley while studying metals at Pratt. The emerging artist Two-Tone Square Knot sort of playfully confronts gender norms by depicting her knowledge of knot tying, a skill often imparted to boys. And on the left, we see Inheritance 15 by M.J. Tyson. She really builds on the past lives of objects, reconstituting forgotten metal jewelry and objects acquired from estates into new work like this. So, how do you tell the story of a craft school? This is something I thought about a lot as I was organizing this exhibition, and certainly it includes finished objects, many of which we've looked at here, but for an artist or craftsperson, there are, as many of you probably know, innumerable hours of thinking and material study that have taken root long before there is a finished object on a pedestal or on a wall or in one's hands. And artist residencies are where Peters Valley began, providing the resources to transform knowledge into objects. And I knew that in order to really tell the story of Peters Valley, to tell the story of a craft school, I needed to have that material transformation and that idea of embodied knowledge on view to share this artistic process with exhibition audiences. And here we are looking at the work of Janine Wang, one of our artist residents. But we began last month with the incredible Cynthia Alberto. She is a weaver, she is an educator, she is an activist, and she was a student at Peters Valley in 2008. It was really, as she's often said, her first kind of experience in the craft community after she had just graduated, not long after she had just graduated from New York's Fashion Institute of Technology. She is the program founder of the Weaving Hand Studio and Healing Arts Center based in Brooklyn. She moves very seamlessly in a sort of 360-degree way around weaving. She does weaving, she teaches, she creates wearables focused on sustainable zero waste approach to textiles. And the piece we're looking at here is the Techno Love series made from repurposed fabric by Escobedo Soliz's 2016 Weaving the Courtyard installation at MoMA PS1 in New York. This is one in a series of 30 wearables. They are meant to be worn and are actually performative. And we did end up doing a performance during her tenure at Peters Valley as a resident. And they sort of shut off the outside world when they're worn, right? They offer the wearer the comfort of a weighted blanket and the freedom of movement that comes from this both weight and this anonymity. And in it, she continues, I love this sort of thread that it pulls on the 50-year exploration of Peters Valley of woven forms on the body that really began with Janet Lipkin in 1972. So for Cynthia's residency at the Hunterdon, she created a work in direct response to our current moment. It's called Take Care of One Another. She asked the community to submit messages of healing, which she then wove into this tapestry, which is now on view. It is a really beautiful metaphor and this act of absolute solidarity within the community. And joining us in the spaces of the Hunterdon on Friday will be our next resident artist, jeweler Lauren Eckert, whose work extends wearables into a holographic state. This is Virtual Body 2, which imagines a hybrid of virtual and real worlds. And when it is on view, there is actually a hologram component to it. And as a jeweler, Eckert's work really centers on the complexities of the digital world, which is, of course, made all the more potent in our current moment as I'm speaking to you on Zoom, and we are all living in very virtual worlds. Her work is influenced by science fiction and past sort of depictions of the future. She defined this focus while she was an undergraduate, metals at Tyler, as I mentioned, and a student of Doug Bucci. And these sort of candy-colored coded coloration of anodized aluminum and titanium will be the focus of her residency, which she begins on Friday. She'll be there through the month of November on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. So I hope if you go see the show, you will come see her. And it's interesting that weaving becomes this theme that is woven throughout all of the residency work. Here you can see she has woven anodized titanium into synthetic relic on the left. And then we can look at the work of Janine Wang, who will be joining us as a resident in December. Her work, she came to Peters Valley as taking a basket making course over a weekend. And she also got her MFA at RISD School of Design and studied wood turning at Philadelphia's Center for Art and Wood International Turning Exchange Residency. And she really merged all of these skills in her hybrid turned wood bowl baskets, which you see here on the right. This is going to be the focus of her residency. And these innovative works, again, really build on a legacy that began long before. I can't help but think of the woodworkers, Joyce Anderson and Carolyn grew Sheridan's own turned wood work. So to conclude, there is this ongoing community of exchange that I have seen anchor Peters Valley throughout its 50 years, giving a shared sense of purpose to the individual artistic growth that happens on its campus. Craft schools like Peters Valley are not always the first line on an artist's or craftsperson's resume, but that is not a reflection of their impact. For the artists discussed here and countless others throughout its history, Peters Valley has delivered a foundational layer of support, connection, and development on which to build. So the lives and works here demonstrate how an idea begun in the secluded environs of Peters Valley has spanned really across artistic networks while forging also very deep personal connections. And though this educational community is often described as small, this 50-year history, I hope you can agree, begins to tell a larger story of Peters Valley that has been built from the ground up. So thanks, and I look forward to chatting with everybody. And
I would love for anybody who's got a question to put it into the Q&A. I see that we have a first question. Well, not a question. Actually, Norma Bucco says, "What a wonderful history of Peters Valley." Thank you, Norma.
thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for doing such a wonderful research. I mean, one of the things that I love is seeing all of the influences and how I always think about the cross-pollination that happens at Peters Valley when the artists are together and they learn from one another, and how the different mediums can sort of inform.
Absolutely, and we see that over and over again. That was a point that came up quite a bit, how artists really drew not only from this sort of deep material understanding of their own fields, but also this opportunity to really cross networks and cross ideas around those things. And I think has led to a lot of exploration for a lot of artists.
I think so. I mean, I've certainly seen it manifest, which is part of the wonderful joy of working at Peters Valley.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions? Yeah. Sometimes I have to look in the chat.
Sure. I'll look too. But yes, I
did see Cynthia Alberto. She said hello.
Yes, the wonderful Cynthia, the brilliant Cynthia.
I think we're at 264, by the way.
Great.
Yeah. Oh, here's another question. Just a comment. Thank you, says Joanne.
Thanks, Joanne.
Well, I think that, is there anything that you found that in doing this, I know you had a leading principle and obviously a scope of work, but did you discover anything that you recently that you'd say, oh, I wish I'd had time to look into it? Is there anything else that's
Oh my gosh, yes, like 1,000 things that I didn't have time to go into, or that I couldn't fully research or explore. But there was this picture from the crafts fair, I think in 1978, that had all of these inflatables. They literally look like sort of clear, almost raft-like objects that people were climbing into, that were floating in the sky. And it led me down a path of learning about sky art and kite making. I could never quite link the artist who had done them with Peters Valley, and couldn't quite figure out the connection, but it definitely would be something that I would love to figure out, because sky art and really thinking of the sky as a canvas is something so thrilling and so connected both to experimentalism and to craft in a way that is both thrilling and incredibly unusual. It opened up a whole new world for me. So it's really exciting.
That's really interesting. The one time I took my kids camping at the beach, there was a kite festival, and it was absolutely stunning. The choreography and the fiber work really.
I see Cynthia's asking, what did Cynthia asked, was it exciting to go through the archives? Great question. The answer is yes. And the answer is, it's really arduous too. And I think that it takes a lot of time. And I think that's something when you think, oh, an exhibition, like why does it take 3 years, or why does it take 5 years? And you realize the amount of time and energy spent in chasing down, right, all of these leads and figuring out, sort of replacing history, right? It's so thrilling and it's so exciting, but it is also incredibly challenging work in the best way.
I would say an observation is that you're almost like an archaeologist Patricia Muller, who, hi Patricia.
Oh my God, thank you. Thank you. She's like the archive master. Thank you from me.
She's our secret archivist.
Oh, she's incredible.
And she said, I have more PV stuff. Are you interested? So
Yeah.
And Peter
Great.
most of the artists at Peters Valley seem to work independently. Has there been much occasion for collaboration with materials and artists?
Yeah, I mean, actually, Kristen, you probably can answer that better than I. Go ahead.
So I would say, Peter, that one of the things that I've observed at Peters Valley is that simply from the artist lectures that happen on Friday nights, everyone's introduced to the artists and what they're doing in the medium. So everyone there has a chance to learn about something they may not know of material. And then certainly the assistants cross over because they're living together and they're learning and they get to take a class and they get to try and be curious and they share with one another. So I think a lot of the experimentation happens through being there. And certainly your curiosity can be piqued when you're exposed to material and approaches that aren't necessarily part of college curriculum.
Mhm.
Right? So,
And also all of the facilities, right? You know, it's all kind of there. Do you find that?
yes, the fact
Yeah.
that the studios are set up, certainly. So MJ Tyson says, thanks so much, Elizabeth. Have you had any craft school experiences yourself?
That's a great question. I'm going to admit right now that my craft is writing and curating, exhibition making. I think of that as my craft. I have had limited craft school experience and would like to have more, definitely. And was, yes, I would like to have more, although I know that my skill set, I leave those skills to the artists among us. But yes, for material study, absolutely. It's really important to be able, if you're writing about something, to be able to understand it from a material perspective, right? What are the technical challenges and how do you understand a piece from that perspective? But skill wise, yes, I leave that to the artists.
Well, MJ says it's so much fun to have a mix of backgrounds in the classroom because people bring different perspectives. So great.
Yes, that's true.
Thank you. Does one thing, if you don't subscribe to Hyperallergic, you should. It's a fabulous art news outlet, hyperallergic.com, and they did a beautiful article on Peters Valley's exhibition at the Hunterdon Art Museum. And I just want to say that we are so very grateful to all the work that you've done, to our funders, and to our partners at the Hunterdon Art Museum who have been so gracious. And it's just been so very exciting to see this exhibit come together. And congratulations. And also thank you so much for bringing the idea of artists in residence to the program, because I always think that at Peters Valley we have craft history in the making. Certainly made that the case. And we have one more comment here from Peter Simon. It's a wonderful history of a wonderful place, beautifully presented, many thanks.
Oh, thank you. And I hope all of you that can go see it will go see it. It's on view until January 10th, but there's also for those that can't go, there is a nice virtual version on the Hunterdon website. And of course there is the catalog.
You can buy from Amazon, and we will have some at the gallery as well very soon. So thank you. If there are no other questions. Oh, Nava Milliken says, on the exhibition and publication and the hyperallergic write-up as well. what a wonderful program of art and making in this region, and the way Peters Valley has facilitated this. And Nava, you have to come see us when we open up. Thank you for joining.
And thank you, Nava. Yes, the amazing curator for the Center for Art and Wood. Thank you.
All right. Well, having no more questions, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Rachel, for manning the technology for us. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.